Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Good evening over in Europe and good very early morning over in Asia. Thank you for joining us. We are plowing through the MSP Spring Quarter Tech Talk series. As you may recall, we fancy ourselves having real academic content, academic in a good way, relevant content that is, we'll get to our sponsor in a moment, but it's generously underwritten by sponsors, including SolarWinds, Intermedia, and eFolder. We're going to hear from eFolder today in just a minute. A little bit of housekeeping. Please use the questions feature on the control panel to ask your questions. And Jennifer Hallmark is going to read those out today. So we're shaking it up here in late June, and it's probably a good thing. I'm starting to see more and more out-of-office communications as people are out of pocket for a little bit of vacation. Before you know it, we have the major USA holiday of July 4th coming up. It's on a Wednesday, which would suggest to me everybody is taking the week off. A little bit of forward-looking statements. So we have the reschedule of cryptocurrency next week. You may recall the gentleman had a family tragedy and some other things back in April, so we have Matt Anderson back next week to wrap up spring quarter. We will be announcing summer quarter shortly. I am confirmed for the CompTIA ChannelCon conference in Austin, Texas, and then probably tack on a few others. I know this week I am missing DattoCon, and I am missing Automation Nation, but for a very good reason. My son finished his 4-year degree in aerospace in Cal Poly, and I'm coming to you live from the Mojave Desert. I mean, it's this Mojave aerospace facility with Virgin Galactica. Richard Branson, Paul Allen has a facility here. I'm looking at rotary rockets. So we'll have a little bit of fun weaving that into the fabric of today, but let's get to the formal introduction of our speaker, or better yet, Dana, a quick introduction, and then we'll hear from eFolder, and then we'll have a more formal introduction. So Dana Epp, a long-time community member. Dana, say hi, and then let's do this properly after we talk to eFolder.
Sounds good. Hi. Good. Thanks for letting me be here today.
Cool. And folks, you're in for a real treat with a security conversation, which is always hot, combined with Azure. So it's actually quite good. With that said, Corey Heinz, you and I were just joking before we went on the air. We could probably wave at each other. Let people know, where are you, sir, and what are you wearing?
Yes, absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Corey Heinz. I'm a sales engineer at eFolder, specializing in all of our product offerings. As he was saying here, so he's based in Mojave Desert, Southern California. I am in Palm Springs, California. So we could probably go outside and wave at the mountaintops and actually see each other. I'm wearing flip-flops and surfboard shorts, standard business attire, of course, right?
Well, certainly in California.
Yes, exactly, right.
Yeah, living the dream. Corey, let's start with you, and then we'll weave in some eFolderisms. But again, tell us what you do as a sales engineer. How did you end up at eFolder? What's your background?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So my background, the funny thing, you mentioned aerospace. I have a background in flight engineering in the Air Force, which is kind of where I got my technical roots from. I've always loved technology, just kind of along the way. Being a sales engineer here at eFolder, I specialize traditionally in all of our BDR offerings. So I'm a disaster recovery expert, and I've just kind of basically planted my roots here and learned all of our product offerings and the MSP space. Prior to eFolder, I also worked at an MSP as an engineer and NOC manager as well.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. So that's actually really cool, because I always like, I tell you what I like, Corey, then I'm going to tell you what I don't like. But what I always like is someone who's actually carried the bag, right? You've been out in the field and you've done it. And that's invaluable. And what I don't like is just the opposite. People who, I'm not going to focus on it, but people, quite frankly, who haven't, walked in the moccasins of an MSP. And then more importantly, they don't, there's musical chairs in our industry, and that kind of bothers me that we should have more DNA diversity, I guess is what I'm saying. I'll leave it at that. So, sir, you are bringing some DNA diversity. Question for you is, with eFolder, what niches do we talked about aerospace? Have you worked in some niches or aware of niches that eFolder plays in, like aviation, aerospace, healthcare, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, we kind of have I don't want to give just kind of a generic answer about that, but we really kind of have more of a blanket offering since we are a channel only cloud provider for MSPs. It's really specific on which MSPs their clientele they really want to go after. But yeah, to answer your question directly, I have dealt with our partners that deal in the aerospace industry, engineering, manufacturing, product design, multimedia, movie production, some large mainstream phone apps that I can't name, but you guys almost guarantee have them on your phone, and those IT providers for those type of channels, we fully support pretty much any and all of those mentions and a few in between all those cracks.
Cool. Finally, some folks have joined late. So, folks, if you've just joined us, this is the 5th MSP Tech Talk on Security in Azure with Dana. I'm talking to Corey from eFolder. And Corey, as always, thanks to you and eFolder and our other sponsors, this allows us to be on the air and provide real solid content. So thank you. And but with that said, you always give it your best pitch for people who may have not, they're not as familiar with eFolder as they used to be. eFolder is reintroducing itself to the SMB Nation community. Could you kind of rattle off the 4 or 5 product areas you have, and then we'll call it good?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So eFolder in general is a channel leading cloud provider offering MSPs a full productivity suite for business continuity to include backup and disaster recovery, file sync and share, and cloud-to-cloud backup. So on the screen here, you see Anchor, which is our premier file sync and share offering built for the MSPs from the ground up. And you have Cloud Finder at the bottom left there that is going to give you cloud-to-cloud backup for Office 365. And then you have backup there that is our file and folder level backup for all 3 operating system types, so Linux, Mac, and Windows. And then we, of course, have our full BDR offering with Replicate and VRC.
Very cool. Well, Corey, I want to invite you to stay on if your schedule allows, but thank you for coming on. And with that invitation, Corey, you are welcome to interject if something is interesting to you from Dana's presentation. But thank you, Corey. Thank you, eFolder. Dana, back to you, my friend, the man of the moment. And I was really thinking about you where I needed to kind of find a landing pad, if you will, for this webinar. And I ended up here in the aerospace complex in the Mojave Desert because, Dana, I mean, I want to tell on you, I remember you spoke at a spring conference in Atlanta, New York, years ago. It was a weekend conference, SMB Nation Spring. And after you were done and after the conference was done, I am going to say you went to the movie theater and you caught the Star Wars or something. So I wanted to connect the dots, Dana. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, for those who don't know me, I've been in the SMB community for a very long time. And I'm passionate when I'm not work, watching movies. I used to own a movie studio that used to film and do B-roll for a lot of the Vancouver movies that were out here as a secondary job that I always had. But my passion has always been security, especially when it comes to how to protect resources. In the old days, it was all on premise, and how do you safeguard the data as companies were starting to grow and adopt to be able to access it from almost anywhere. And I was a big fan during the Microsoft SBS world. That's actually how I met Harry, was learning and wanting to secure that infrastructure. And the world just keeps changing, Harry. It's here we are. It's, what is it, 16 years later since I think when we first really kind of got together, and the world's changed. More workload is happening in the cloud. But it's funny, a lot of people, especially in the SMB world, are always talking about, well, I can't go to the cloud. My business doesn't support that. My customers won't go there. And the reality is when you think of how Microsoft positions it, and you kind of see that on the slide, it's really about the intelligent cloud working with the intelligent edge. And that intelligent edge really is any device that you use or consume. That might be a PC, that might be a phone, that might be an IoT device, and everything in between. And what's interesting is a lot of it drives from what's happening in the cloud. And so I've been a security MVP with Microsoft for 14 years now. I've got that award. And I'm on my 4th year now as a Microsoft Regional Director, which just, what it really means is, like, if you want to go look at my background and dig that stuff up, you can go to microsoft.com/DNAP and kind of dig in to see what it is. But mostly it's about understanding how to talk about things like Azure Cloud from a business perspective as well as a technical perspective. But I don't work for Microsoft, to be clear. These are awarded designations that we have. So as an MVP, I get to work with the actual tech community and work directly with those program managers in the Azure working groups and be able to be there. I've been an Azure advisor for almost 7 years now. But then as a regional director, that's where I get to work directly with the executives, right? So we're really talking with, the Scotts of the world and really driving through and finding out, where are we going? What are we doing? And how can we play in there? And how can we be successful? My day job, though, I work at Wildbrook, which is a new startup I had. For those who know, I used to build a product called Auth-Handle, which was sold to Kaseya, or I was the CTO there for several years as we migrated more of that stuff into the cloud. And I went off to work because I started seeing that there was a huge gap in cloud security and getting that right. So at Wildbrook, we built something called AuditWolf, which you can check out at auditwolf.com, which is really a cloud threat protection platform for Azure. And what it does is it makes it easy to detect and find security violations and help you understand how to remediate those risks. But I'm not here for work. I'm really here to talk about the back end of that, which is really about Microsoft Azure and how to look at that from a security perspective and how you can follow what I call the 8 rules of Azure security to really safeguard those workloads. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. One of the things, I was at Build just recently down in Seattle, and Satya had this quote that I thought was just so amazing, that aligns and helps us understand what exactly is happening in our world today. And that's, this is actually a quote from 1991, where Mark Weiser said, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it." And if you think about it, we're there today. We may not everyone feels that they want to be in the cloud, but you're in the cloud if you know it or not. And in the Azure world, if you're in the Microsoft stack, you're doing it all the day. So if you're using Office 365, you're in the cloud. If you're taking advantage of using any of the AI models or the artificial intelligence machine learning that's happening in things like in Cortana, it's happening in Windows 10, those things talk to Azure and they work on there. And what's interesting is Microsoft says that by 2020, that's only a couple years from now, they're expecting to have over 20 billion smart devices that are talking into the cloud and on-premise. We're talking tons of data that you as a person will have on you. We're thinking about 1.5 gigabytes of data a day, right? Your smart homes might have up to 50 gigs a day. Your cars, right? The autonomous vehicles that are out there, they're going to be driving like 5 terabytes of data. Your offices these days are now driving, there's more and more data. It ends up being that in a connected world, you're talking hundreds of petabytes of data that needs to be managed. And that all can't be on-premise. And that all can't be in the cloud. And depending on what you're trying to do, if you have a smart home, like, I used my iPhone and I talked to Siri to tell her to open and close my blinds, right? That all actually drives from a cloud service that's being then handled by my intelligent device that's on the edge to allow me to talk with my cloud services that helps drive those type of things. This is an exciting time. It's accelerating. There's data being everywhere, and we need to think about how we're going to safeguard it. Because it's never been better if you're a developer or an IT professional to be responsible for the applications and infrastructure, and helping to understand how to make that safe is paramount. It is a full business opportunity for you. And it doesn't matter how big or small you are at the end of the day. Now, the interesting thing, a lot of people say, well, if the enterprise isn't adopting the cloud all that much, it's not going to work in the SMB. Because usually we lead. It's kind of interesting. Enterprise will go on the bleeding edge on certain things, but then ultimately the SMBs are the ones that adopt it, make it all work. 90% of the Fortune 500 now use the Microsoft Cloud. And they're using that for not just things like Office 365, but all different types of workloads. And if you think about it, it's making Azure become the world's computer. If you think about it, there's now 50 different regions around the world that Azure runs in. They have over 70 different certifications for protecting the information and the resources that are in the cloud. In fact, Microsoft now supports more regions and certifications than any other public cloud. And they do that so they can meet our digital sovereignty and regulatory compliance needs. So depending where you are in the world, I know we have people from all over here. If you're having to deal with certain types of data sovereignty rules and regulations, Azure's got your back, but only if you know and how to use it. Because if you don't configure things correctly, you can very easily have data synchronizing in places that it may or may not be allowed to go. On top of that is when we're talking about the cloud, we always have to start thinking about the edge as well. And Microsoft's been working very hard to make sure you have those experiences where you need it. So not only do we have the Azure cloud, you have things like Azure Stack, which is the ability to actually run all of those cloud resources and bring them down and run them on premise. Now, that's not a small thing. That's not running on a single machine. The Azure Stack is a very, complex copy of a lot of the services that are in the cloud that you can run. And this is useful for like businesses that have a lot of data that they just can't ship up, but they need to be able to process it and manage it. And Azure Stack is very exciting for being able to do that type of stuff, because now you can have your own private data center. You can have your own workloads in your own facilities and act and work the same way as what you might be doing in Azure. So when we're talking about a lot of the security benefits and the 8 rules that I'm going to talk about, you can apply them to Azure Stack just as much as you could apply them to the Azure cloud. Of course, we're also starting to see lots of different types of devices, smart devices out there. Microsoft's announced things like the IoT Edge is now being open source, so anyone can adopt it and build that into any type of smart device that they want out there. And just a few months ago, they announced Azure Sphere, which is actually a hardened Linux-based operating system that runs in a chip that gives us the ability to be able to apply this at very low cost into almost any type of device. So you think about that. If you're an IT professional responsible for managing devices, doesn't it make sense that everything you have viewership into should be able to be managed, maintained, and secured? That's a huge opportunity, but it's also a huge responsibility. And that's something we need to understand, is that as developers and IT professionals, we have the responsibility to build trust in technology. It's not going to be driven by the vendors. We're the ones in the field that are having to apply this and to do this. So it's interesting, because you got to think about it, is why is cloud security so critical then? Because if we have to build trust in cloud technology, we need to understand why. What is it doing? And where do we fit in there? And there was a survey that was done by the Cloud Computing Review Survey where they found 86% of the companies cited that data breaches and data losses are the reasons why they're hesitant to adopt the cloud, because it's so easy to misconfigure. And even in my own work, I see that too, because when we look at our customers that work with us, 73% of them, we found at least one cloud misconfiguration that impacts security. So when you're doing those initial audits, we're finding that people are just not configuring what's happening in the cloud in the safest way possible. And it's because the pace of innovation is happening so quickly that it's hard to keep up with what's happening. Just to keep up with learning, the new services are there, and when the services are changing and what security safeguards might be there to help you, it's hard to keep up with that stuff. Not even 2 years ago, by default, when you rolled out a SQL database in Azure, it didn't have encryption turned on. Now, every single new one created has that on. But what happens if you have that database from 2 years ago running? It doesn't have the encryption on, and you don't know, it's a checkbox to turn it off. And if you don't know that, that becomes a risk, if that means that your data at rest is not encrypted and there are ways for other people to gain access to that. But let's put that in practical sense. Let's talk about real world examples of where this is hurting us. So I'm sure you've all heard of Uber. You've probably used it. For those who haven't, it's this application you can use that you can order a driver to take you from point A to point B, and they use the cloud to actually drive that. And here's what's interesting is that last year, attackers stole data from over 57 million individual records from the Uber systems. And the reason that happened was some developers left the access keys and the secrets to the cloud accounts in their code, and then they checked that in to GitHub. And in that scenario, attackers were able to gain access to that, use that as a pivot point, and then gain access to the rest of the cloud environment. And ultimately now, those Uber software engineers are, well, there's now a class action lawsuit that's going against Uber, where they're looking at the fact that when they detected this, they did not notify their users of the breach. And when millions of people aren't getting notified, and then they find out about this kind of stuff, that can really harm the reputation of the business. And that's a big issue. But it's not just, software companies building that. Even security companies have the same problem. There's a single sign-on vendor out there, OneLogin. They're one of the top 5 vendors for delivering single sign-on experiences out there. Attackers found a vulnerability that allowed them to get access to the keys to their API. And then from that, they were able to pivot into the back end of the entire system to gain access to all the identity information of all the users in the cloud. So this happened for almost over 7 hours. Attackers had full access for single sign-on to any cloud service and everything that was on there. And so this happens, right? But let's put that in perspective for things like service providers. So if you know about Ross Perot's a company, Data Systems, that merged with HP Enterprise Services and came out something called DXC Technology, right? They're one of the largest global IT service and solution providers that are out there. What was interesting was that a techie accidentally uploaded the firm's private access keys to a public repo in Git in some sample code. And no one knew about it for 4 days. During that time, attackers took those keys and they spun up 244 VMs in the cloud by API so that they could run those loads to do some Bitcoin mining and whatnot. It ended up that DXC had a bill of over $64,000 on cloud services that they had to pay for because of this. So this is one of the negatives of the powers of what the cloud can deliver you. Because when you have the ability of infrastructure as a service that allows you to spin up infrastructure very, very quickly, cost comes along with that. And so it's important to make sure that you're able to audit, review, and protect that to prevent this type of stuff. Because while dynamic infrastructure is a blessing, it can also be a curse. So it's happened to them. Will it happen to you? Like we might think that this will never happen to us, but these tools these days can look for these type of weaknesses very, very quickly, and it's not personal. They don't care if you're a one-man shop or if you're one of the largest IT service providers in the world. If they can gain access to the infrastructure or the APIs, it gives them power to be able to do interesting things with the public cloud computing environments that exist. So what we're going to do is talk about what the 8 rules of Azure security are and what you can do and what you can implement to be able to help protect against that, to reduce the risk to a more reasonable level when you're starting to use the cloud and when you have your customers leveraging that. To understand how that works, though, you need to realize that cloud security is a shared responsibility. You can't abdicate that responsibility to the cloud vendor. So if you can take a look at this slide right here, we're talking about what Microsoft's responsibilities are versus yours as the customer, right? And so you can see there's really 4 different options you have. So on the far right, you have on-premise, right? You own all of that. So from the physical data center and the network, the host, the operating system, network controls, all the way up the stack, you are responsible for everything. And that's kind of what you do day to day today. But then you start looking at things like infrastructure as a service, right? The IaaS. And now the physical data centers and network and hosts, you don't have to manage that. That's Microsoft's responsibility. But you're still responsible for the operating system and the network controls and the applications and the IAM and the access and everything else. And of course, the data is always your responsibility. You can keep moving to the left and you have things like platform as a service. So these are where Microsoft provides a managed service to you in some sort of platform that you can leverage. And now even the operating system is not your responsibility anymore. You don't have to patch it. You don't have to maintain it. That's their responsibility. And you kind of share responsibility with things like the networking and the application controls and configuration. So now they can help with some and they are responsible for some, but you're still pivotal to making sure that that infrastructure is being protected until you go right up to SaaS, right? So when you're using something like Office 365 or you're using Dynamics or anything like that, now you don't care about the application or the network controls or any of that. You're really focusing on client access and the data. But at the end of the day, what you can see throughout this whole thing, the top one there, data governance and rights management, client endpoints, that's you and your relationship with your customers accessing the actual output from this software and applications, the data. You're responsible for the data, not Microsoft. And that means that is a huge responsibility, but it's also a huge opportunity because it has you being able to provide the value chain on how to protect it, be that being able to back that up, restore it, keep copies of it, understand who has access to it, understanding who shouldn't have access to it. All of that comes through from the shared responsibility model. And so make sure that you think about that when you consider what are you using in the cloud, because at the end of the day, you lose access to certain controls now, but those are good. You don't need to worry about patching anymore, or maybe you do if you're managing the VM. You don't have to worry about how the network's configured, but maybe you do if you're starting to have these things talk together in different systems. We're going to talk about that. So the first rule I want to talk about is what I call the rule of least privilege. Right? This is where you need to make sure that you give your people and applications only enough access so that they can do their job. This is a corner keystone of good information security. And you want to make sure that you're always thinking about that. In Azure, the best way that you can do that is understand how the role-based access control system works. So there is, at almost every level, at every resource, at everything that's inside of Azure, you can apply roles. You can have things like reader roles and writer roles. You can have admin roles. You can have limited roles like security auditor roles where they can look at certain things but not actually adjust them. It's important that you understand how the role-based access control system works and then make sure that you're managing it in a way so that you're giving the right privileges to the right people at the right time. So where this becomes important is if you give someone, as an example, full admin rights to an Azure subscription, they have access to everything. And that may not be the intended thing you want to do. Maybe you have a junior admin that is responsible for making sure things are backed up for these clients and not these other ones. So you can assign by resource group who has access to what. And these are built right into the system. And you need to be able to look at that and make sure that you're applying the right controls to handle that. Moving on, one of the next things to think about is try to disable guest access. And if that's not possible, make sure that the guest user perms are limited and never allow guests to invite others to join the Azure AD domain. So these are actually just checkboxes inside of Azure AD configuration to make a determination if you want to allow guest access or not. So now you might ask, well, wait, I want guest access because I need to be able to share my documents in OneDrive with people that aren't in my organization. There are RBAC and remote guest or anonymous privileges you can give to those. You don't have to give someone actual true guest access into Azure AD. Because if you do that, now they have guest access to any of those resources that are tied into those systems. And if you don't apply those safeguards correctly, you might be giving them access to systems that you don't expect that they should have access to. So just remove it. You don't need it. It's very rare that you need to have guests that's on there. You should also consider restricting access to the Azure AD admin portal. Again, this is something that you can configure in multiple ways. You can configure it with certain types of IP restrictions. You could have only certain accounts that can have access to the admin portal. And when you do that portal, it's not just the portal itself, but some of the APIs behind the scenes, so that if an attacker was able to gain access to a credential, they don't have the ability to elevate or provide themselves with more access into the identity and access management plane, which is what Azure AD is. It is actually the cornerstone of all authentication and authorization decisions of all resources in Azure. So restrict that access to only the people that require it. And then on top of that, ensure that no custom owner subscription roles exist. When you're setting up these different roles, you have the ability to create custom roles that do lots of different things. I'm actually going to tell you not to do that. Now, there's good guidance and bad guidance that says you should always to create special sets of roles and permissions to be able to handle all this. But if you start doing that at the subscription level, it doesn't populate down the way you think it will to other resources. There's no resultant set of policy validations for roles that be able to tell you if you make a change down the line that won't be adjusted. And what happens is that Microsoft has these built-in roles and they validate across all different resources. If you use those built-in roles, you'll be in a better way to go and you'll understand it, because the best thing and the worst thing that happens in security is if people don't understand the access systems. So if you start creating these custom ones that no one knows about, there's no way for you to audit that to know what's actually happening under the hood. So make sure that you're using the built-in roles to do this instead. The second rule is the rule of change management. And this is a huge thing. How do you know when things happen inside of your Azure environment? Well, here's the first thing that not a lot of people understand. By default, logging is now actually turned on. So you need to ensure that you turn on a logging profile so that you're actually auditing. Now, to be fair, certain resources always log. That's just always going to happen. But the detailed things like change events, the opportunity to actually know when something changed in the environment, to be able to pinpoint what's been going on if some kind of behavior changes, doesn't happen unless you turn it on. So turn on, create a logging profile and make sure that it's in the system and that you have a retention of at least 180 days. And I'm actually going to recommend that you go and set it to 365 days. Now, you're going to say, well, no, that's just too many logs. The cost of the audit logs is so low in comparison to being able to go back and see in time what has happened in your cloud environment. And if you start utilizing third-party tools, they actually can take that information as a data source input to be able to look at patterns of behavior. So if they ever start wanting to do things like behavior analysis, which you can do in things like Azure Security Center tied into machine learning, the more data you have helps you to understand what is the normal behaviors that are happening in the cloud. So we can look for suspicious anomalous behaviors based off of the log history that we have in the environment. The next thing is make sure you turn on Network Watcher. This is one of the things a lot of people say is, well, I can't control and see what's happening as these resources are talking to each other and what they're doing. And that's absolutely not the case. If you turn on Network Watcher, you have the ability to enable the tracing of information. So if you're used to things like being able to see source and destination packet traffic and being able to use things like Wireshark and all those, there are tools that when you combine Network Watcher with the network security group flow logs, you have the ability to actually trace what resource talked to what resources at what time, how much data transferred between them, what protocol was used, how was it used. You literally have the ability to watch network infrastructure and do the infrastructure management you want. If you don't have that on, you don't know what's going on and you don't have that visibility. So make sure you have that enabled and you have the NSG flow logs turned on and that you have at least 90 days of data there. Again, if you start using things like Azure Security Center or using third-party tools, having that amount of data helps us to understand contextually how resources talk to each other. So then you have the ability to say, I can see that this Azure VM is talking to this Azure Cosmos DB and it's happening between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. And hey, now I can start looking for traffic anomalies to be able to see what's going on so we can start pinpointing what's happening in the system if there's problems. Also, make sure you start doing things like turning on active log alerts. And what you're looking for here is to be able to use monitor for the create, update, and delete events for network security groups, network security group security rules, SQL Server firewall rules, and for security policies. Now, let me explain why that's important. These are the core areas that allow you to make a determination of how people and applications can talk to your cloud resources. And if you have the ability of being able to have these events happen in these log alerts, you can then take advantage of things like Azure automation or take advantage of their serverless compute with things like Azure functions to be able to start creating ways to tell you when changes occur that are anomalous or outside of the standard behaviors of what you want. As an example, you want to be able to know when someone changes the SQL Server firewall rules that allows someone to have access to your SQL data. Instead of you chasing that down, just have the active log alerts turned on for SQL Server firewall rules, and it will then signal and send an event. And then you can use event-based decoupled compute to be able to go and configure things. You can use a logic app that you can build, which is this visual designer that would allow you to do things like automatically send you an SMS messages when that happens, or have the ability to automatically publish to your Microsoft Teams or your Slack channel that the attack posture of your SQL Server has been adjusted. Or know when someone does something like deletes a network security group rule that's now giving them more access than they should have. It's very important to be able to look and have these. And here's the thing, turning it on doesn't hurt you from a business perspective. There's a slight amount of increase in cost because of the logs that you now have, but it is so minuscule in comparison of the information that you now have at your fingertips that you can then start leveraging and utilizing. And if you don't leverage it for proactive you still have reactionary abilities to be able to go see what's been going on. These aren't on by default. You need to turn them on to be able to use them. One of the other things, since we're talking about SQL, turn on SQL auditing. If you're running SQL in Azure, turn it on. Because if you turn that on, then you can also turn on the SQL threat detection for both SQL servers and the databases. This is important because now you have this power to be able to use Microsoft's threat intelligence feeds and their information to be able to look for things like people that are doing SQL injection attacks on an Azure SQL server. They will be alerted. You will actually get a log item saying there was a SQL injection attempt that was here. In many cases, they'll actually block those type of things, but if they can't, they'll still detect it and alarm you, which is not something you have on premise for your standard SQL server. So you start getting to leverage their benefits of their security teams in the cloud, looking at this type of information. And of course, if you're going to turn on auditing for SQL and you turn on threat detection, please, 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 at least set the log retention to be at least 90 days or more. That way, because you're not always going to be able to be proactive and take action as it's happening, you can look back and see just what's been going on. So in the face of a breach or in the face of an issue that may have occurred, and when we talk about this, it may not be an active threat that's going on, but someone attempting to do it, you can at least start looking backwards. Combine that with things like Network Watcher and the ability to track the traffic flow as it's going on, you start being able to contextually put into perspective how resources are being accessed and how suspicious behaviors can be tracked down to its source. The third rule is the rule of trust. And this is interesting, specifically if you're managing as an MSP or you're a cloud administrator that has multiple people in there. You want to make sure that it's not about you. It's really about the customer owns the data. They own the resources at the end of the day. And if you're administering it and you're responsible for it, you want to know when there is a huge change to that trust model. So the first thing you want to be able to do is make sure that you turn on that all administrators are notified when an admin password is reset. That way, if someone is trying to reset an admin credential, you want to know that that's been going on. Sometimes it's a behavior that is expected. No one's harmed, but it's when it's not, and someone's able to use some of the online password reset mechanisms that then give them more access to the system. That's something you want to know about. And again, this is just a checkbox inside of Azure AD to be able to alarm you, to tell you when any admin password is reset. The second thing, though, is please require two-factor authentication for all admin logins. This isn't just about access to Azure AD. This is to the entire access to the cloud. Because someone that's using the Azure PowerShell module or the Azure CLI, when logged on as administrator, has full privileges to everything by script. And that means that malicious code that can run on an administrator's desktop for a user that's logged in has the power to completely take over or destroy your cloud resources. You don't want that. You want to make sure that there is some sort of other way to verify trust, and do so by using two-factor authentication. Now, Microsoft already has built into Azure AD the ability to tie this in. The cost base is so low, there's no excuse for not turning 2FA on for those privileged accounts. Ensure that you have RDP access from the internet blocked. There is no reason that you have to have direct access to the via RDP to these resources. When you do need access, you can use things like Microsoft's just-in-time access controls, which can then launch an interim RDP access window to that system as required. You don't have to have direct access all the time. And while it may be convenient for you, you're exposing the system to unnecessary risk that's not always needed. And if you're not going to listen to me, then at the very least, make sure that you are using IP restrictions and other mechanisms to limit that. But just don't allow it. Have the network security groups block all RDP access to the internet. Same thing with SSH access. If you're using systems that are based off of Linux or other operating systems that have access to an SSHD, the daemon, make sure that's blocked as well. And of course, if we're not going to allow you to have interactive access to these systems, let's also make sure you don't have direct access to SQL. There is no reason that you should have to have access to SQL Server from the internet. If you need that because on premise you have access needs for the to the database, then consider using separation of zones and use something like Azure virtual networking and connect that as a VPN into the system. You do not need direct access from the internet. You're just asking for trouble. The next rule is the rule of information protection. Remember, if we were looking back at that shared security responsibility model, data is your responsibility, nobody else's. So even though Microsoft does a really good job of making it available, by default, a lot of the different data stores that are available are not properly protected, and it's your responsibility to ensure that they are. So make sure that data is encrypted at rest. So when you're using storage accounts and you're using SQL Server, you want to make sure that you're turning on the data encryption requirements on those on there. You also want to make sure that the data is encrypted in transit. So if you're doing things like using Azure Storage, by default, it allows you to connect via standard HTTP. Turn that off. Require them to do it over SSL so that they don't have the ability to just access the information over a clear text stream. If you're taking advantage of using some of the SMB protocols and whatnot for Azure file storage, make sure those are encrypted. There is no reason why those should not be encrypted at rest and during in transit back to your PC. Again, if you're using SQL Server in Azure, make sure that you have those databases turned on with what's called TDE, Transparent Data Encryption. Again, it's just a checkbox. This stuff isn't hard, but we need to make sure we're turning it on. Good news is Microsoft has been seeing that over the last year, and a lot of these services now have a default setting of that turned on. So all of Azure Storage, as an example, when you create a new storage account, they are now enabled by with encryption by default. And if you are using any storage account that was turned on that was using ARM or Azure's Resource Manager, they turned on encryption for you. However, if you have storage accounts that are older than that, they're not encrypted, you need to go turn those on. When we start talking about the VMs, if you're doing infrastructure as a service, make sure the OS disks are encrypted. Why would you have your VHDs to be available and accessible by other people and not in an encrypted manner? And of course, the data disks as well. You want to make sure that those are all set up to be running and are set up to be encrypted. Ensure storage blob containers are not public. It's surprising how many times people will go and set this up to make it easy for them to exchange information with other people and not recognize that when you set up the container, you're allowing all data in that container to be public, not just for the individual file that you thought you were doing. Also, make sure your storage keys are regenerated regularly. This is an interesting problem. Microsoft doesn't actually track when keys were created or changed. So it's your responsibility to make sure that you're routinely changing them out. That way, if someone was able to gain access to a storage account, those keys will get invalidated and they'll be prevented access. Or better yet, don't use storage keys at all. Instead, consider using shared access signatures and have these tokens be designed to work over a small period of time so that they'll expire. Maybe you say, hey, I want to give a SaaS token or these shared access signatures limited access to a certain object in Azure and allow them for 12 hours. That way it can automatically expire it even if you forget to go and do that. And that's by default, that's not the case. You create the SaaS tokens, they'll last for as long as you want them. Set them up to make sure that they expire and make sure it's reasonable. Usually you don't need to have more than access for more than 24 hours. In many cases, I usually set SaaS tokens to be 4 hours. Give the token, say they have to use it, and that way then it's done and it's out of your hair. Also make sure that SaaS tokens can only ever be used over HTTPS. So even if someone does misconfigure their storage account and they don't have data in transit forced over SSL, but they have SaaS tokens, we're making sure that they can't be captured and reused and forcing them to do it over a secured transport. If you're using things like Azure Key Vault for being able to protect your keys and your secrets, please make sure you set expiry dates on these. If you don't, that means people that have access to the your keys or your secrets in Key Vault will be able to do that infinitely. And because Key Vault automatically supports the ability to rotate keys, you should set a very short expiry date on these so that they can regularly be changed. And then what ends up happening at the end of the day is that you can take advantage of things like ARM templates and ARM configurations to index that information in a way that's reasonable so that you don't have to change the applications. They'll be able to maintain the secrecy and the rotation of all that stuff throughout the entire ecosystem. So you can set an event that says this key is now expired, a new one's been generated, here's the new one to use. That way, you never maintain the secrets in the applications or in the infrastructure, store them in Key Vault where they're supposed to be, allow Key Vault to automatically rotate those keys and secret access components so you don't have to worry about them. Rule 5 is the rule of separation and isolation. I really want you to think in terms of zones. And what's interesting is we've been doing this as IT professionals for years. We just haven't thought about them when we're working in the cloud. You can think of a zone as really a grouping of resources with similar security profiles. So common scenarios might be you have a trusted internal zone, a semi-trusted zone that might be like the DMZ, and an untrusted external zone. What you really want to do here at the end of the day is think of a subject that is like a person or place or somebody that needs to have access to something, or what we call an object. And when you start looking at this, what you're trying to do is make sure that when a subject wants to access as an object, it's doing so from the same zone, or the requester has a higher level of trust than the ones doing it. In other words, you don't usually want someone from the internet to be able to actually directly access your database. If they have to do something like that, then consider using some sort of intermediary and having some way to sync it or manage it so it's going the other direction. You can't always do that, but if we start thinking like that as a default way, then what we start doing is having a more secure default, because now we can start saying, do we need direct access to that data, or can a different service that we may expose in a semi-trusted zone be able to interact with that in something we can audit and control better, and then allow much more limited access to the resources for the subject that's trying to access that information, i.e. the user. In other words, you might have a SQL Azure database that's in a trusted zone. You may have an app service or a VM that's in a semi-trusted zone that is accessing that information, and you only expose that port or that service to the end user, and they can't have direct access. Those types of having this rules of separation and isolation helps to ensure that people aren't having direct access to resources that they don't need to. Now, this isn't a cloud security rule. This is really just true information security. You should be doing this on premise and have been doing this for years. Now you just need to start thinking about how you're going to do that in Azure. This is where you start using things like network security groups. You're using server and domain isolation combined with Azure networking, so that you could then start being able to isolate and separate this information at the NIC level, at the network level, and at the application and resource group level. Of course, we've been talking a lot about the technology, and that's not where it all ends, right? The cloud security is not just about technology. It must include implementation, monitoring, and maintenance. Use whatever you want. You have an RMM that you like, and it has the power to not only look inside of infrastructure, but look at outside, use it. Take advantage of things like the ability to have the event monitoring sources, things like the alert stuff I was showing you at the beginning, and make sure that you're bubbling that information into the monitoring systems so that you have the capacity to be able to handle that. You know, it's easy for administrators to love turning on, you know, new fancy whiz-bang things, and in Azure that becomes easy. You literally just say, add resource, fill in a couple of fields, and it auto generates that infrastructure. Or if they have access to the API, you can do it in a single command. But you don't follow the entire security management lifecycle that way. You're not thinking about in terms of zones. You're not thinking about what resource groups are we putting that into, who has access to that information through a role-based access control. And then, of course, when we think about the maintenance of that, what are we doing at all times to make sure that we know who's responsible for it, when they're responsible for it, and what's going on. As an example, if you know you're using platform as a service, well, you're not worrying about the operating system for patches, but for even infrastructure as a service, you may, depending on what kind of VM you have set up and how it's being managed. And these are your responsibility to understand. At the end of the day, you must understand what is being monitored and logged and know when something is going wrong, so you know how to respond to it in whatever tools that you use. Of course, once you know you're implementing, monitoring, and maintaining everything, we can now start thinking about preventative action, right? So you got all this logs, you got to start using it Tune for silence. Look for what is normal behaviors and then make sure your filters are ruling those out. So you're only looking for anomalous behaviors. If you don't do this, you're going to get overwhelmed because there'll be too much log data that you won't be able to handle it. Regularly test your defenses using assessment tools before an attacker does. Here's my little plug. This is kind of what things like Audit Wealth are all about. It's that we look at this for you and we can identify security violations so that you don't have to worry about it after the fact. Microsoft has built-in tools with the assessment auditor. They have things with the security center. You can use third-party tools. Just make sure you're doing that. And then, of course, maintain the threefold process and keep your systems up to date. It's very important that you consider that, especially when you're dealing with infrastructure as a service. You're still responsible for making sure that those systems are maintained and updated. And the final rule is the rule of immediate and proper response. At the end of the day, I hate to tell you, but you're still going to have an opportunity where things will get misconfigured. Something will go wrong. Something will happen that you didn't account for. With the pace of innovation that's happening in public cloud these days, as things change, you won't know about them. You can't keep up with all of this. It's just the reality of the world. So you need to make sure that you have a rational, well-thought incident response plan. At the end of the day, you want to stay calm, collect all the audit data, restore the deployments and data, and move on. And that's where you want to partner with vendors that have the ability to deal with BDR. You have the ability to take advantage. Microsoft has really good backup capabilities. A single checkbox, you can turn on VM backups as an example, which is very powerful to have. But on top of that, because you're responsible for the data and the configuration and ultimately the access control, all that stuff, consider thinking about having external resources out there. And that's kind of the whole, you think about the sponsors of this event, things like eFolder have technologies for backing up cloud to cloud. They have the ability to back up the infrastructure in the VMs. It has the ability to take the configuration information and have audit trails. You can use RMM tools out there and infrastructure from companies like SolarWinds that can be able to give you that access if you need to. And of course, built right into Azure, a lot of this stuff is there. It all comes down to what is your time worth. There are vendors that are building the tools that can help you do this stuff. Consider using them. And if you don't want to use them, then understand the infrastructure you're using and make sure that you stay calm and practice restoring and resolve. This is the power of things like ARM templates, Azure Resource Managed templates, and doing infrastructure as code. Literally, you can have this scripted so that if something was to go wrong, you could make sure that you can take a backup of your data, simply wipe and restore that infrastructure and reattach the clean data, usually within minutes, depending on how it's there. Because this is unlike the old days where it would take you forever to get the infrastructure, do an OS install, reinstall the applications. These days, based on ARM templates, you literally can actually have entire infrastructure up in less than 5 minutes. We actually use, when we do some testing, using Azure Dev Test Labs, we actually spin up 1,000 Windows 10 machines, plus a domain controller and all the infrastructure in less than 30 minutes, have it all domain joined and connected so that we can do infrastructure testing for some of our agent-based stuff. And so that kind of power comes because of what's available in Azure, which we never could do on premise. But with that comes a lot of responsibility. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure you maintain those 8 rules. If you do that, you will be in a far better state to be able to maintain the security posture that's out there. And remember those numbers. 86% of the customers surveyed said they are concerned with moving to the cloud because of data security issues, because of breaches, because it's so easy to misconfigure. And as I was showing you from our own data that we've seen from working with a lot of customers, 73% of them had at least one misconfiguration in their cloud that impacted security. So 3/4 of the people out there have things that they could be improving on. I'll bet you that's you too. And so that's one of those things you want to keep doing. I'm going to publish this on my own blog. I actually have part of this out there ready right now. I think it's the 8 rules of cloud security, because it's not just about Azure. These same principles can be applied to your Google Cloud or to your Amazon Cloud. At the end of the day, cloud infrastructure should be treated no different than what you do on premise. You're responsible for maintaining and managing it. You need to understand what the shared responsibility model is with the vendors for the cloud side of it. But with how quickly infrastructure can be updated and moved around and how easy data can be accessed, ultimately you want to be able to use standard good hygiene when it comes to IT management and apply that to your cloud. And those are the 8 rules of Azure Security. Jenny, if you have any questions that have come in, I'd be more than happy to answer those now.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dana. Just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, please use the questions feature within the webinar system. We do have one question, which we'll start with, but hopefully some additional questions keep rolling in. So our first question is, why would you strongly suggest that data is encrypted at rest any more than otherwise necessary if the data is secured in the Microsoft facility?
It's a great question. So I believe that Microsoft as a company, and any cloud vendor, by the way, when we start talking about encrypting data at rest, it is because at the end of the day, you are still ultimately responsible for that information. If a vulnerability was found in some third tertiary system that would give you access, example, let's say that you're accessing an application like a Redis cache, and that's a managed service, a platform as a service and as a SaaS service. Microsoft has 2 different versions of it that would give you the ability to access that data, and that data is then being stored in, let's say, some at-rest store facility, and someone was able to get exposure to that root of that. Let's say it is a data disk. If they copy that off, and now someone else got access to that, or let's use something more common. You have a technician in your organization who, because they have access to your Azure storage account, could copy that VHD off. Now they have access to that data and you don't know about it. So it's not going to be issues about, the NSA black bagging into a Microsoft data center and finding which one of your servers they're at. That's not what we're protecting against. The fact of the matter is that because this data is now more equidistant for how people access them, based on your IAM controls, people may have access to infrastructure and information in ways that you don't plan to have them. If the VHDs, as an example, are encrypted and someone pulls that off, if someone clones that into their own storage account and you no longer have visibility to it, the data is encrypted and you can't walk away with that without knowing. Now, there's an argument to be made that, well, anything you can encrypt, we can decrypt and have access to it in other ways. Yep, but those go through controls that you can audit and see. So an encrypted disk that's at rest, when you spin up the infrastructure into Hyper-V and they roll that out, the system has other infrastructure safeguards, i.e. IAM, 2-factor authentication, everything else that's on there. So they're not going to be able to get inside of the infrastructure to handle it. But because you can reconstitute that information, remember those VHDs can be rerun on premise with some changes. You don't want that information to be able to be walked away with from other people that may have access to your infrastructure.
Perfect. Thanks, Dana. Just to confirm, did you say the slides would be available on your blog?
No, the actual at daneup.com, there's actually a blog post with these rules on there. I will actually create a PDF of these slides, and I will make those available as well. So I'll tweet that out. So
perfect. A follow-up to the last question, but what you are saying is true of it. But what you are saying is true of any server?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't see why you wouldn't. Like, you should, if you have infrastructure on premise, why aren't you using BitLocker on your servers, right? Why aren't you taking advantage of this infrastructure? Why haven't you been using EFS for the last 20 years where possible? Because the thing is at the end of the day, there's a balance, right? Security is a process. It's not a product. It's not any one thing. Turning one thing on isn't going to just prevent everything. But why wouldn't you? If there are known ways of behavior to be able to isolate and limit and force people to go through the right security control. The best security systems are the ones that no one knows about until they come up against them. In other words, they're doing something they're not supposed to. Your servers should be encrypted. If they're not, you really need to now there are some people that argue and say, well, we can't for performance reasons. That doesn't cut it anymore. Run your performance tests. because a lot of the OS disks running on SSDs, running on BitLocker, have better performance than the servers we used to have 5 years ago. And there's no reason why not to do it. Now, there are arguments to say, well, then it's harder to restore, it's harder to recover. Well, there are processes for all that, and all of that can be automated. There's no reason. And in Microsoft parlance, when you encrypt OS, when you get that checkbox in the cloud, they take advantage of doing things like they will take your keys that are used to do the encryption, and they create a dedicated key vault for your account for that infrastructure in there. So they don't even have direct access to it. It's all automated directly through their HSM, the hardware security module that handles the key safety, and uses that to decrypt that information. So on a restoration operation, a backup operation, all that's done for you. You don't need to understand how the encryption works. They take care of that for you using Azure themselves to be able to safeguard those keys.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And we got another comment. Thanks, Dana, Harry, and Jetty.
Well, appreciate that. Now, I know some people are going to say, like, you know, those 8 rules, if you think about it, I think there's like 20, 30 bullets. When it comes to the security controls that Azure has for looking at from a security perspective, there's over 280 of them that you need to know and understand. And I get it that some people, that's just too much to learn. And it's always changing, right, as more resources and services come available. So I want to make a commitment to this group. You know, I don't sell directly into the SMB, so this isn't something that I normally would do on that. But anybody that wants to, contact me. Go to autowolf.com/MSP Tech Talk. Fill that in. We'll actually I'll sit down for 30 minutes. We'll have a conversation, look at your Azure environment, and we'll talk about what opportunities exist there and what risks that exist there, and I'll help you out in where I can. And at the end of the day, that works good for me because I get me more access to more information of how you guys use the cloud to help us build better tools. And there's no cost to you there, and I won't be trying to sell you anything on there. That's just my time with you to review that stuff over time. So if that's interesting to you, please go check that out. There, I'd be more than happy to have a one-on-one conversation on how you use the cloud today.
Perfect. Another great talk. Good session. Thanks, Dana. Dana, it looks like you answered all of the questions throughout the presentation. We'll give it another minute or so, but I don't see any additional questions coming in. So thank you so much. And we will send an email out with the replay of today's session if you'd like to replay it, or for anybody who missed it, as well as I'll also send out information for next week's webinar. This last webinar, we do not have a double week break. It's just a single break as we're doing a makeup session. So hopefully we'll see everybody next week for the webinar, and I'll get all that information out. Thanks so much, Dana, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.